Joined today by our friend Jacob. Jacob is the SVP of engineering at ShipBob. We're grateful to have him here today, and I'm grateful for all of you tuning in. So I'll pass the mic to Jacob. Would love to hear, Jacob, a bit about what you're working on today and a bit about your recent history. What brings you to where you are now?
Yeah. No, thank you again for having me. Um, so, like you mentioned, I've been with ShipBob for quite some time, seen some pretty massive growth over the last couple of years. I think for more recently, a lot of what I've been working through is a little, I would say, in some respect, it's a little less engineering focused, a little more organizational focused. Um, as your organizations grow over time, you need to think through a number of things that are more tribal knowledge when it's just a handful of people. So great example is I think one of the things that we're really spending a lot of time on lately is data. Data about the teams, data about finance and throughput and access to data and reportability. Lots of data points to capture and distribute and define, right? Even just agreeing with multiple parties in your organization around how to calculate something is sometimes a very challenging thing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you jumped into there, and one I'd love to kind of follow up on a little bit. One of the challenges, of course, is getting those kind of shared definitions. I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of things that you've maybe seen that have worked or failed, or where that's introduced challenges. It's something we've certainly heard a lot about with people using DevLake, of course. The simple, like it's almost so simple it's upsetting, right? Where it's like, what's the value of DevLake? Oh, now we just have a shared definition of fill in the blank.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that when I first met you and you had talked a little bit about DevLake, it definitely piqued my interest as it just having a definition of velocity, right? And having an easy way, or maybe not an easy way, but a way, right, to report that and have it standardized across teams is it's a huge bonus. And having something like that that's open source is a pretty incredible tool to be able to leverage.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've heard so many, like we've had so many interesting conversations with CTOs, VPs of engineering from, I think the largest is like a 60,000 person company, but I found it's true all the way down to like a 10-person org, where just being able to say like, hey, when we're talking about speed, when we're talking about, tech debt, if we're talking about cycle time, like here's specifically what that means, and here's how we're thinking about it, and here's what we mean when we say fast, here's what we mean when we say buggy, like here's what we say. And I found just level setting on that kind of set of definitions drives so much success, and when it's not there seems to drive quite a bit of failure and burnout too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you hear a lot, and I've heard this over and over, throughout the years from different parties and different companies. What's taking so long, right? Why is this taking so long, or why is the team going so slow? Um, and that usually stems from not having a good baseline to start with, right? It's usually and it could be anything. It could be the team. It could be why is revenue not accelerating the way I think? It could be many different things, but certainly around teams. Why is the roadmap taking so long to get through? What's the cycle? Why is the cycle time so high? And establishing a baseline on that is super important, because otherwise there's nothing to compare it to, right? When people say it's slow, there is no definition of fast. So no matter how fast you go, it's always going to be slow.
Exactly. No, I think you make a really excellent point there, and one that I definitely want to emphasize for the listeners is like that is really where the value of those benchmarks come in, right? It's really all of this stuff ends up being relative. Like if I come up to you one day and I say, hey, great surprise, I'm giving you 600,000 units of money. Like, great. Like, could that buy me a lot? Is that going to be life changing, or is that going to maybe buy me my lunch if I'm lucky? Right. But then as soon as you have that benchmark where you can say, but hey, like that unit means, one burger is 1 unit. Okay. So I could buy 600,000 burgers. Now I understand. Right.
Yep.
It's those benchmarks that really give you that kind of understanding to compare and understand like whether you're at where you expect or if you're under or overperforming. And that's where that art form really starts to come in. So it's an excellent point that you bring up there, Jake. I'd love to start all the way at the beginning though. I'm so excited to already be diving into so much kind of relevant detail here. But before we do that, I'd love to understand. I've always found engineering leaders have such kind of diverse backgrounds, especially when it comes to their kind of starting story. I'd love to hear, Jake, what kind of got you into being a software engineer as a profession? Like, where did it all begin, and what has your kind of journey been like getting you to where you are today?
Yeah. I actually started in mechanical engineering way back in the day. I remember taking a couple. Actually, my software engineering days might have actually started closer in high school. I had I'm trying to. I think it was a Visual Basic course, and I knew back then it was kind of like right in the middle of the tech kind of bust, right? So everybody thought of that as very much kind of a novelty, so to speak, right? It was like it was the boom and bust part. If you put .com behind anything, you would get funding for it, and all of a sudden, the bottom fell out of all of that. So yeah, I remember like way back in the day, we actually built, and I don't know why I didn't take this a little further, but we built a Visual Basic dating app for high school, and we used it as a fundraiser, and it worked phenomenally well. But I was just maybe a little short-sighted on the entrepreneurial side of that. But yeah, so I started out in mechanical engineering. Did a little stint in the military. Was a truck driver in the Army for a little while. Went to Iraq for a little bit. And when I came back, I had not quite finished my undergraduate degree, so I went back to school. Wound up taking I'm trying to remember. I think it was a C# like intro class and a SQL kind of like just basic kind of entry level stuff. And I was like, wow, this is actually what I want to do, because it's a very similar, I think, creative outlet to more of like a mechanical engineering thing, except instead of seeing the cycle time in months or years or decades, even sometimes with larger projects, you see it in potentially hours or days or weeks, kind of at the most on that. So went back to school, finished up an undergraduate and then a master's degree in computer science, and really started my first software engineering job at a little consulting company in the suburbs of Chicago. And that was kind of my, I think, first foray into kind of a high growth kind of startup, because we went from just a handful of folks to I think it was just under 200 in a couple of years. So it was really exploding. It was pretty amazing. Then I spent some time. I think I spent about 7 or 8 years there. And I wanted to see what the really large corporation kind of job description meant. So I actually got a job with Deloitte. Worked with Deloitte for a little while. Realized that there was a lot more, I think I call it PowerPoint engineering, right? A lot of architecture, a lot of technology choices, a lot of organization, and all of those things I think are super, super important, super useful. But it certainly wasn't the type of work that I wanted to do at that point. Um, after a pretty short stint there, I decided I wanted to get back into kind of the more entrepreneurial side of the software engineering world, and went over to an incubator in Chicago and met a couple of people from a little company called Uptake, which was just like a glimmer in the eye of one of the founders of Groupon back in the day. And that was kind of the start to the real explosive growth type of startups that I've been working with. So same thing there, was one of the early, 3 or 4 engineers, and we grew that to about 400 engineers really quickly. Amazing. We did some really amazing engineering work. There was solved a lot of very interesting problems. But I think personally for me, just seeing how you went from 3 or 4 engineers to 400 engineers was the huge learning aspect of it. And that was over a pretty short period of time. It was about 3 years. Then kind of shortly after that, my wife and I actually, my wife wrote a book, and she said, "Hey, I want some e-commerce. She's like, I want to sell some T-shirts and hats and stuff with this. And you're the tech guy in the house, so go figure it out." So I started looking around, and I started noticing this weird company called ShipBob coming up in a lot of conversations, and I was like, "What a strange name! Why would anybody call their company ShipBob?" And started realizing what they did with this e-commerce fulfillment, which was pretty interesting. So out of the blue, one of the recruiters, kind of hit me up from ShipBob and said, "Hey, we're looking for somebody to come lead our engineering team. We're growing really quick. Looks like you've got some experience doing that." So I remember sitting down with the founder, having a conversation, and his phone was sitting on his desk right next to him, and it kept buzzing as we were having this conversation, and we were really kind of having a good time with it. And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't want to, distract you. I know we're over time, but it sounds like you've got some phone calls to answer." And he goes, "Oh no, those are just," he's like, "I have alerts coming through on my phone every time somebody new signs up for ShipBob." And I was like, "Okay, there's a product market fit here that is pretty phenomenal. This might be worth kind of getting into." So that's it in a nutshell, and here we are today.
It's amazing. And I imagine probably some of your experience in the military too probably gave you some disciplines and some thought processes to structure like complex, large processes. I'd love to kind of, with that as a segue, you've clearly been through some pretty fabulous growth stories, going from those early stages where it's kind of scrappy, just get the job done, to those kind of growth stages where you're figuring out like what does process even look like, to the larger stages where it's refining those processes. Some amazing experience, and I would love to kind of hear like some maybe anecdotes or lessons that you've learned from that. Like what do you kind of consider some of like the most fundamental challenges to building out a growing engineering organization? Like when you make that leap from maybe like the first handful of engineers to like, okay, let's double headcount, let's start getting more serious. Like what are the things that maybe people aren't thinking about, or the things that surprised you when you're like, oh man, like once we went from 30 to 100, it was completely different and we had to figure this out?
Yeah. So I think there's quite a few. There's kind of quite a few stages in there. I think you can scale to, around 10 people pretty easily with very lightweight processes, right? Very just good communication can solve a lot of things up to about 10 people. And it depends on those 10 people for sure. And then you have to really think about two things. One is the, kind of like roadmap of what those 10 people are working on, and the reportability. Because if you're thinking about, okay, well, there's 10 engineers here. That's actually quite a huge chunk of especially a small startup's revenue and costs and everything else. Um, so you have to start thinking about, well, how do I get the best return on investment, right? And I think at that point is where you really need to start thinking about agile software development instead of just, hey, go build this feature, right? Come back in 2 weeks and deploy it. Um, so right around that 10 person mark is where I think, people should really start thinking about, all right, well, we should have sprints, we should have, some sort of roadmap that we're working down towards, so that other people in the organization can say, okay, the engineering lead over there is spending, X amount of money to support these 10 engineers to build this thing, and this is what we're getting in return. Kind of, lower than that, I think you can get away with a lot looser, uh, a lot looser kind of organizational structure. But then you really need to start thinking about, okay, how do I take those 10 and grow that into a couple of teams, 3 or 4 different teams. And those teams could be, pretty small to start. And you can think about who are the engineering kind of SMEs on those teams that are going to lead those teams, because you're probably not going to be in a position quite yet to say, well, I have to have a product manager for every team. I have to have an engineering manager for every team, right? There's definitely a point where I think that becomes a reality, but those kind of early stages where you're kind of just separating out into, maybe 3 or 4 teams, you can get away without really having that in there. But you really need like that subject matter expert in the code base that you're thinking about. And I think at that point too, you really need to think about, stretch your imagination a little bit and think about what the future structure of your code base is going to look like, because that depends on how you split those teams up a little bit. Are you going to have, you can split it up by technology, you can split it up by business domain, you can split it up in a number of ways. Having done, I think, all the ways that you can split those things up, I definitely would say that there's a benefit to actually keeping a monolith at that point, because it just simplifies all of the overhead that you may need to do, right? The deployment structure, the testing, right? Even just something as simple as merging code in. When you've got a monolith, it's actually pretty easy to make sure things aren't broken. When you start splitting things up, then you've got integration tests to deal with and everything else, and you really need to start thinking about, well, how much overhead am I going to invest into making sure that all of these things are playing nicely together. And then when those 3 or 4 teams start to grow and you start to contemplate, like, well, actually, this little corner of the domain that I thought wasn't so big is now getting bigger and bigger. You hit a point you hit a point there where things start to become difficult from merging code and doing builds and even just like developing, right? No, at some point there, you're kind of getting into the situation where different teams are working on different roadmaps and backlogs, and you'll find your development environment or QA environment, whatever kind of environment that you're using for the, kind of merging of everything, it just gets clogged up, nothing happens, and things kind of come to a screeching halt. And that's where I always use the analogy with the business people, because they don't quite understand any of that at that point. But I use the analogy of, imagine there's a table, right? And we're all manufacturing something. You can only put, 4 or 5 people around that table before there's just no more edge space around it to put another person. And then that's kind of the analogy that I use for explaining why we need to invest in building out like development environments, right? Or testing environments, right? Or kind of migrating to a more advanced branching strategy, things like that. And just saying, there needs to be there needs to now be at least two tables, right? We need 6 people around this one and 6 people around that one. And when we get to 18, we're gonna have to do that again, right? So that's not like a thing that it's not like a thing you do once and then all of a sudden you're good forever. I think that's a definite hurdle to get through, because it really you'll feel like you kind of hit a brick wall. Coded, you'll have PRs that are trying to get merged and integration tests that are failing, and it'll become kind of a mess until you kind of split that out. And then I think a little further down the road from that, you really run into the, if you've kind of split out your monolith a little bit and you've started to, separate out some of the super high load or high, compute capacity things or data, processing things from the more monolithic stuff. You'll definitely hit a point where that deployment process needs to become a lot more mature and a lot more documented, rather than just, hey, lead engineering type, can you make sure you deploy that this morning, right? And it depends on a lot of the different technology choices and complexity, but I think there's a point kind of beyond that, 3-4 teams, where coming up with a really defined deployment process and a schedule and making sure the rest of the business understands that sometimes those don't always go super duper smooth, is a pretty important point through there. Yeah, and then I think it largely becomes around processes after that, right? Everything that you used to do with tribal knowledge then becomes something that you need to document, and you need to build processes out, and you need to do training on. I think at some point too, you really need, depending on if you're investing in automation testing, or if you've survived with manual tests up to there, you need a kind of a regression effort somewhere in there, whether that's an automated regression effort or a manual regression effort. Usually it's some combination of that too, right? Where you've got some automation tests, but you need some regression in there as well. And then definitely when you start getting beyond the point where everybody knows everybody, you really need to start thinking, or actually probably quite a bit before then, but you need to start thinking about hiring, right? Because up until that point, everybody knows everybody, and everybody kind of understands, like, this person will, fit in well with the organization, or this person will bring something new that we need, or this person, won't. And you really need to start thinking about putting together, the list of people that you want to be on those hiring committees, and the people that are going to be doing the kind of bar raising, so to speak, if you want to borrow an Amazonian term there. But to ensure that you're hiring the right people, because that can also kind of sneak into your organization really quickly and become either a real benefit or a real problem.
Absolutely. It reminds me a great kind of quote a mentor of mine told me years back, which always stuck with me. Was he said, "Growth hides all evils," and I think that can be so true. And I love the visual metaphor of developers working at a table. I think that really does articulate it quite well, right? This idea that you can't just, if you have like a puzzle sitting on a coffee table and you've got people working on solving that puzzle, you start with one, you can add 2 more, you're going to get faster at doing that puzzle. But if you suddenly figure, let's throw 27 people at that table, like all of a sudden people are fist fighting, elbowing each other, like getting in each other's way. And I think it's a neat way to really visualize, like, yeah, you got to break it up into some units. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you got to grab maybe a handful of those puzzle pieces, put them on a different table, get the ergonomics working, start figuring out, like, okay, you're going to focus on the red pieces, you're going to focus on the blue pieces, and figure out, just to extend your metaphor, like it makes so much sense to me. I'd love to get your perspective, Jake, on certainly the hiring piece. I imagine you've seen certain maybe types of engineers or personalities on the development team that really maybe thrive in the early stages and become problematic or just not a fit at the later stages.
Hmm.
I'd love to hear your perspective. Like, what would you say kind of makes a great engineer at like a larger scale organization versus maybe what makes a different kind of great engineer at those earlier stages?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's actually a huge it's a real thing, and it's also one of the most challenging things because it brings a lot of emotion along with it, right? Not only for yourself but the rest of your team. I think early on in any, especially in engineering, right? You need engineers that are kind of fearless, right? Um, and it's probably not the engineers with the longest tenure or the most experience, right? Um, some of the places that I've found those, kind of like fearless, full stack, I'll just go figure it out type engineers, um, are in some of the most odd places, right? But I kind of, my analogy there is these are kind of the cowboy coders, right? It's a little bit lawless, it's a little bit messy, but it's the sheer determination that you need to build the things that you need to build to get the product to where it's a product market fit. Um, and you need somebody that's willing to really think about what's absolutely necessary. If you think back to, did you ever see the movie The Martian with Matt Damon, right?
It's one of my all-time favorite movies.
It's such a great movie. And I use this example quite a bit. The scene where he drives out to that rocket that's sitting there, right? And it's all perfect looking, and it's got all the stuff in it, the food and the suits and the seats and the nose cone. And then they tell him, all right, take everything out, right? Take the nose cone off, throw a tarp over it, empty all the lockers out, take all the seats out, unbolt everything, and basically you're just sitting on this. He winds up just like sitting on a rocket engine with himself, more or less duct taped to a seat. Those are the types of engineers that you want to think through, that are going to really get you started and get you moving, because you really have to get down to the bare bones basics as your product is growing, as your team is growing. That's when you need to start thinking about, all right, where do I find the person that's really good at Kubernetes, or where's my database experts, right? Or where's my SME and whatever technology that you're going to need. And you need to also start thinking about folks that might put a little more value into process and documentation and some things like that. Sometimes I see engineers that can kind of transition easily between the let's just get it done and working stage to let's actually build a system that's going to develop software. But it's not very often. There's not a huge overlap, because the kind of people that want that freedom and flexibility to be creative and really crank through code aren't always the same people that are happy in a super disciplined, process-driven environment. And sometimes you need to even think through what parts of your product or application need to be in what stage too. Sometimes there's core business features that are really driving the engine of revenue that keep your business alive, and those need to be protected, and you need that super heavy disciplined process following type engineering group running that. And then sometimes you need a group that is a lot more on the cutting, kind of on the entrepreneurial edge, where they're still trying to get this feature adoption up, or they're trying to build, kind of a parallel part of your business. And you need to have engineers that are there that may not be super successful on the other side as well.
Yeah, I love that idea, right? The Martian analogy is certainly a good one, and it's an interesting point that you make also, this idea that even as the organization itself grows, you can still kind of conceptualize like the earlier stage, more kind of cowboy aspects of the product versus the more mature pieces. And I think it's a really important point that you make there, which I think, at least this would be my assumption, right? Then allows you to be more dynamic with your hiring and get a more kind of diverse crew of people
Mm-hmm.
into the product and into the code base, where you can say like, okay, this is where like kind of faster paced, more kind of innovative, more kind of risk taking work is done, and we get the people that are great at that in that particular line of work, and
Mm-hmm.
the people that are kind of like the superstars with process, with delivering insanely robust, super stable, minimally buggy stuff, like here's where they're going to go. And
Mm-hmm.
there really is a home for everybody if you're thinking through it that way. I love that point.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a huge benefit to both, right? You really need to be aware of that, because they're sometimes those types of engineers clash quite a bit too, right? And you need to be the peacemaker kind of in between. The one thing that I would say, if you do right, if you do find yourself in a situation where you really do have that like creative problem solving entrepreneurial type, software engineer who's kind of like, the in the wild west of where, the wild west corner of your product building things, and you have those very process driven, super scalable type engineers building other parts. You really want to think about how to isolate those two from each other, because they will drive each other crazy. You don't want that new feature to bring down the core business, and you don't want the core business to slow down the innovation of the new features. So
Yeah, it's really well said. Something that I personally haven't thought a whole lot about, which is a fun one to consider. I'd love to know, Jake, 'cause you've seen so much, and I imagine through that process, you've surely, like we all have, kind of run into some brick walls and hurt yourself to figure out what the process or approach should be. I'm curious if you were to kind of look back through everything over the last few years, and if there's one thing that you kind of know now that you wish you knew when you got started, or if someone was coming to you and they said, "Oh, like, hey, Jake, like I'm about to embark on this journey, and I'm coming in as the CTO of let's say like a 50-person engineering team, and they're anticipating, hey, we're going to raise 120 million next year, and they're telling me we need to like triple the engineering headcount over the next 16 months." Like, what kind of advice would you give them, or what kind of advice would you give yourself if you were kind of going back to that point in time?
yeah, um, I think there's there's definitely a couple of gotchas when you're kind of going from that, 50-ish person team to, 150 or 200, size team that you need to watch out for. Certainly on the, like I said that earlier, the hiring aspect, you need to have kind of a rock solid process for that, because everybody's going to come into those interviews with a different definition of what good looks like at the end. And unless you're driving that, consistency across the interview process, you're going to get wildly different outcomes. Might be more successful, some might be less successful, but it's going to be very uneven. Um, that's definitely the one thing, because you're going to get to the point, up until about 50, chances are you may have actually interviewed all of those people, right, and given the thumbs up and driven the organization to hire most, if not all of those people. At the very least, it's going to be the more senior influential folks, right, that you've done that with. When you start talking about, tripling your team size, you're not going to be interviewing every one of those people, more than likely. Or if you are, you're ignoring a different part of your job that you really need to be thinking about as well, because there's going to be other fires that pop up. So spending some time developing a really rock solid interview process, where, you're thinking about what type of engineers you want for what types of jobs, is going to be super important. And then doing some training with it, like sit down and do some mock interviews with people that are already on the team and point out the little things that you're always looking for that might make the bigger difference between, success and failure and building the team, significantly larger. The other thing that you really need to think through there too, and this is a little more on the management side. It's really easy for some of those early engineers to feel like they're the ones that need to be the directors and the senior directors and the VPs and things like that. I think that's the point too, and maybe even a little bit before you get to that like 50-ish head count, where you really need to establish like a pretty solid definition of titles, right, and job tracks. Probably separate out the individual contributor job track from the management job track. Because what you don't want is, you don't want everybody every amazing engineer that you have to decide that they want to be a manager just so they can get, career growth. That's not what you want. You want to give people a track all the way up to those more senior levels in both the individual contributor and that management role. Because way too many times I've seen amazing engineers move into management type positions and they're miserable, you're miserable, the people that work for them are miserable, simply because they're not doing the thing that they love to do anymore. And they're only doing it because they want to, we all want to progress in our career. I think that's the second one. And kind of along with that, you have to watch out for like the inflated title, the inflated title kind of problem, right? You need to think about later on in the organization, when you're at that 2 or 3 or 400 kind of realm, is this person that you're promoting to, senior manager or principal really going to be a principal at that point, or really going to be a director at that point? Or is your definition of what a director is going to change? Because then you run into this like really weird thing where you have, somebody with years and years and years of experience being an engineering leader, and you've got somebody who's, they've been at the organization for 3 or 4 years, but their skill sets are vastly different. But now you're talking about bringing them in at the same level or the same title, and it's obvious to everybody else that one of these things is not like the other. But you're kind of in a sticky situation where, you've kind of painted yourself into a corner. And I've done that too. So I've made that mistake myself. It's not a fun one to be in, because it's obvious to everybody that it's uncomfortable. So really thinking about that title inflation and making sure that you're planning not just one step ahead, but 2 or 3x ahead is pretty important there. And then, just like I had mentioned earlier, very much around that, how many people can we put on solving this puzzle? How many people can you put on this table? Because that'll come out of nowhere, and you're 50, when you're going from 50 to 75 or so, it'll grind everything to a halt. It'll simply, you'll not be able to have, and it'll take a while to work your way out of it. So thinking about that ahead of time, preparing those, whether you're going to split up your domain or your code base by, business domain or front end and back end, or however you really want to split it out. And I think there's arguments for doing it many different ways, and there's, depending on your team and your business and everything else, you need to make that decision. But making sure that there's a couple different tables, a couple different puzzles, whether you split it out by repository or domains or feature sets or whatever, and then having those environments to support it as well, making sure that you can still debug things locally and test things locally, super important. And then you'll get to the point too where data becomes a real issue. You'll have different teams developing in different environments, maybe different development environments. And you'll have this like feature data creep where, one team will be working on feature A that'll produce all this data and they'll be able to test, feature A over here. And another team will be working on feature B, and they might have like the schema for feature A full of data there, but they have no data, right? Because they don't care about feature A that much. They're working on feature B. So at some point you'll run into that. Well, it worked in my environment, kind of test problem, but you get into production and it doesn't work anymore because sure, everything might work with the schema of data that you have, but it may not work with the actual real data. So kind of syncing that data across those teams and making sure that there's good testing strategies with that is super important.
Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. And I think one point you made that I think is such an underappreciated one too is making sure as you grow that you're really creating the opportunities for your star players to have career development while staying in that kind of individual contributor sweet spot where I think I feel like I've read about it so many times, I've heard about it so many times where companies kind of make career development directly connected to management, to headcount, and it perversely kind of puts people in positions where, as you say, they're not happy, they're not doing their best work, and it doesn't make sense. So I think it's really well said. A question I've got for you, Jacob, to kind of close up our conversation, being mindful of time. I'd love to hear, like you've talked a lot about data as well. I'd love to understand, like, what's the kind of role of data in your kind of day to day, and what does a week in the life look like for you these days? Like when you get into the office on Monday morning, whether whether it's virtually or in person, like what are the things that you start looking at, and what are the kind of signals that you're paying attention to when you're figuring out, like, okay, are we on schedule? Are we doing well, or are we struggling? Are there problems buried in places? Like, what does kind of a week in the life of your job look like these days?
Yeah, it's definitely changed a lot. It's changed a lot over the last year, and actually it's even changed a little bit over the last couple of weeks. I'd just kind of anecdotally recently I noticed, I'm like, my goodness, I spend an enormous amount of time in one-on-ones with people. And I started noticing the pattern of saying, the same things in a lot of them, where I'd noticed that I was becoming the information bottleneck there. Um, so, I would say a couple months ago, it was probably about um, probably about 40 or 50% of the time was just syncing up with some of the key people on these teams, both managers and individual contributors, and then also syncing up with people on the business side, making sure that the things that we're building are the things that they need, and trying to identify the hacky workarounds that people use that were never really intended to be used like that. Understanding, spending time with our customers and merchants that do their shipping with us. But yeah, I really wanted to avoid becoming that information bottleneck. So I started doing fewer or less frequent one-on-ones and a lot more group kind of group updates. And this is kind of at the point where you get to the point where you've got multiple managers and managers that kind of need to funnel information up to you. But I think definitely making sure you always have some of that time scheduled is pretty important. On the data side of things, really kind of looking at that high level planning for not even just the teams, but the groups of teams, and seeing how those things are progressing is really what you want to, really what I spend a lot of time doing, just making sure that the things that we promised we're doing, we're actually delivering on. And if there's reasons why we're not, kind of trying to debug and figure out what's going on there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something we love kind of helping people out with too, with DevLake in particular, is like debugging the processes in a certain way. And I think one of the things that I really love to preach too is like it's the data is almost never going to give you the answer, right? It's going to point you to where you should pay attention. It's going to give you a kind of focal point to say like, okay, there's something going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go take a look. Let's have a conversation, kind of equipping you with all of that capability. And I think you've really kind of touched upon, certainly in my opinion, like the architecture of like a great data-driven engineering process, where a big part of it is like let's go and establish some shared, clear operational definitions. So when we talk about
Mm-hmm.
velocity, we all know what that exactly means. And then we go into the kind of benchmarking relativistic piece of it, right? So like now we've got a definition. Let's now figure out like how we compare and what things mean, right? Are we, what does baseline look like, and do we agree on that? And if not, why not? And then that kind of final piece, right, which is the role of a leader. I think it sounds like it's your perspective too, and I think that of many great leaders is like your job is to empower people to do their best work, and that means sometimes getting out of the way, and it certainly means hunting for like where are
Mm-hmm.
the things that are blocking people or holding them up. And I think as you scale, of course, that's, I think that's where data really starts to become quite compelling and humanistic, which excites me personally, where it's not like this kind of detached, like operating a swarm of robots kind of thing, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
figuring out like you got great people, you've got great people, you've done a good hiring process, you've got good kind of developer experience in the consideration, you've got your proverbial tables set up at the right size so people are working ergonomically. And then that question becomes like, how do you know when people are getting challenged or stuck or blocked or something's out of alignment? And that's the role, is to then go in and figure out like what's the blocker, how do we get rid of it, how do we address it. So I think we really kind of covered a lot of fantastic pieces there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think the only other thing that I would throw out there is a interesting observation is that regardless of how much funding you have, how much, big your team is, I'm pretty certain that your business, regardless of what it is, can always find 10% more for you to do, no matter how many people are on your team or how big you grow. Um, so just thinking adding people is not always the magic bullet, right? It's sometimes prioritization. It's sometimes just a number of things, finding more efficiencies within your teams, deciding what's important and what's not. But that's always a thing that I've seen over the years. Well, we'll just hire another team, right? Sometimes that's not the answer. It's,
Absolutely. No, I think that's a critical detail too, because of course the hiring, the onboarding, that takes a tremendous amount of time and energy, of course. And to your point, right, sometimes it's not just throwing more bodies at the challenge, it's figuring out like what's some underlying issue that's maybe preventing us from hitting what we want. And that might come down to prioritization or training or any number of things. So I think it's a really important point you make there to be asking those questions of yourself and of the company. Like, is this really a people bandwidth or horsepower challenge, or is this kind of a priorities or process challenge? And
Mhm.
so it's fantastic. Well, I know we're at the end of our scheduled time here, Jake, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I knew I would, and really looking forward to having more in the future. Um, I thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with us, and thank you all of you for tuning in to listen live, and certainly thank you to all of you jumping on the YouTube to tune in to the recording as always. Um, Jake, if I could pass the mic to you to maybe close us out, um, if you were to kind of give one kind of parting kind of fortune cookie style bit of advice to an engineer looking to make the leap from kind of individual contributor to a manager of engineers, like one thing that you would want them to kind of make sure they get right, what would you share with them?
Wow. It's a really difficult transition, I think, from individual contributor to manager. The one thing that I would say is that you have to find joy in um, enabling people to do their best. Whereas I think, the individual contributor world is a little more inwardly focused, right? That engineering manager world is a little more outwardly focused. And there's going to be days where, you get done with the day and you're like, I don't know what I did, right? I don't know what I accomplished. And you need to kind of view that through the lens of how well did you kind of block and tackle for your team, right? I think that would be the number one thing there is it's gonna be a little bit of an uphill battle to start out with, but as soon as you find that, like, oh my gosh, I actually really did some great mentorship and really helped that team understand, what their true objective was, and they accomplished more than I ever could have they accomplished more today than I could have in a week. That's where you can really find some of that, that creativity outlet, that joy, that progress. But it's not gonna be the same as when you were just hitting the keyboard and doing the coding yourself. So
Yeah, I really like that you said that, and I think it captures a lot of the essence of our conversation too, is finding joy in that kind of more abstract enablement piece of the puzzle. And I can certainly see why that would be a tremendous challenge for many people who are great engineers, where part of what we talked about, right, is like it's fast cycles, it's highly iterative compared to mechanical engineering, where you can ideate, you can build, you can throw into production, it'll work or it won't, and you could do that in the course of hours, right? And I think many of the best performers I've seen, I think, really kind of get that big dopamine hit and that big satisfaction from that kind of satisfaction cycle of like think, do, produce, succeed. And I think it's a really excellent point to wrap up our conversation on, is as you progress into leading engineering, you have to start thinking about like, how are you getting that joy from seeing the net process succeeding at delivering on exactly that.
absolutely, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Jake. I'll of course be in touch. We have so much more to chat about, but thank you for taking the time. Thank you everyone for joining us as always. You'll be seeing the recording on YouTube soon enough, and we'll be sharing all kinds of things as usual on the Slack. We thank you all for being part of the DevLake family around the world, and we will look forward to seeing you all soon. Goodbye for now.